evening. We're in the middle of spooky season, and that's my favorite season. So thank you for coming out. My name is Sarah Colley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library. We love bringing information to you in every possible way, including fun themes like tonight, Scottish witch hunts. So today's presenter is Leigh Larson. Leigh Larson is a storyteller. Whether it's writing, speaking, filming, or digital designing, Ms. Larson aims to make stories relatable, entertaining, and memorable for her audiences. She completed her undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin with a bachelor's in international relations and minors in both environmental sciences and world religion/philosophy. She worked in Texas politics prior to serving as a minister for the USAFR Chaplains Corps and for a church in Denver. She successfully helped start a recovery nonprofit before growing her skills in tech as a web and graphic designer before launching her web and graphic business full-time. She has visited 46 American states and many national parks, as well as traveled in Sweden, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. I feel like that list is going to get longer here in the near future. Oh, we didn't add Pakistan to that list. Yeah, we have to do that too. She is an avid hiker, explorer, a women's advocate, and a collector of stories. Tonight's presentation is on a Wednesday, which is a little bit different than what we usually do with our Tuesday, Thursdays. So the library does close at 6 o'clock. However, you guys are here for this program, so please don't feel like you have to run as soon as 6 o'clock comes along. You will have questions, you will have conversations, so please feel free to stick around a little bit afterwards, all right? We have popcorn and a bowl, a trophy bowl of candy and water, so feel free to enjoy any of that as well. Thank you all so much for joining, and please join me in welcoming Leigh Larson.
Howdy everyone, can you all hear me? Okay, cool. Yep. Howdy. My name is Leigh Larson. Thank you for the introduction, Sarah, and thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining me tonight. I love this crowd, I love the costumes, you guys look great. Man, we got an interest for witches, don't we? All right, well, let's get into it. So before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that this is it is an adult program. There will be talk of violence, torture, etc. So just wanted to put that on your radar that we'll be talking about things that happened in history, not the Disney World version of it. We're going to talk about, we're going to go over the goals of this program, go over the context, really create a story, a narrative to help you understand this world that we're going to be talking about tonight. Then we'll get into the witch hunts specifically, the who, the what, the why, the how, and then how that has impacted culture since then. So the Scottish witch hunts predominantly took place in the 1500s to the 1700s. They are tied to the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. We'll talk about that later. But these were carried out by religious leaders, by political leaders. It targeted vulnerable women and used biblical scripture to arrest them, put them in jail, torture them, and then for many, kill them. They were accused of witchcraft. And we'll get into the hows and whys of that. But it's really important to recognize that all of this was going on during a time of significant religious and political upheaval, particularly in United Kingdom, what is now the United Kingdom. I hope that you guys will understand the context of what happened, the motivations and methodologies, and then really understand the legacy of witch culture, or the witch hunts, I suppose, in contemporary culture. Now, let's set the scene. Welcome to Scotland. I had the opportunity to go last summer. Here is a nice video. You can see it's gray. It's green, very fertile, lush. I went in June, July, but very wet. Beautiful. And in fact, the architect of this church is also the same architect as the red telephone booth that is popular in London. So absolutely beautiful time. I had the opportunity to take trains and stay in hostels for about a week, maybe a little bit less, and loved it. I went all over Scotland. And as it so happened, I attended a Rotary meeting. I'm part of Rotary here in Great Falls, and there's on the western side of Scotland is a small touristy town called Oban, and went to Oban Rotary, and they said, hey, there's quite a bit of Scottish witch history in this region, you should follow up on it. So I did. I cleared my schedule, and I was like, we're doing it. So I went to bookstores and museums and historical markers, and wanted to bring back this knowledge. So where in the world is Scotland? It's significantly north. And this is important because darkness, because of long winters, cold, wet winters. You can see that it's in line with Newfoundland. Like it's even further north than New York, Montana, what we're used to. And it's also really isolated from the rest of Europe. You have to go across the channel and up into England, all the way up into Scotland. So geographically, they're isolated from Europe. Scotland is not the only place that had witch hunts. France, Denmark, Germany, they also have their own witch hunts. But Scotland's was far more violent, and there were a lot more women killed. So a lot of that has to do with them being so geographically isolated from the rest of the world. They weren't having to mix and diversify a lot of times. Now they did do trade with Scandinavian and Vikings from Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and that did lend itself to a lot of diversity, but these were not mainland Europeans that were brought up against a lot of trade and influence of different cultures. Okay. So the witch hunts were not a rural backwoods thing. They happened in urban areas where there was a lot of power struggles, political power struggles, wealth, religion, very contentious in cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh. So you can see in this map, these are the main cities of Scotland, and that's where they predominantly carried out these hunts. And a lot of that's because the more rural areas were far more accepting of paganism. So, like I said, they're isolated. They're influenced by their Scandinavian and Viking trade. But there is, that being far north, long summer daylight, short daylight in the winters, so a lot of darkness, very foggy, as you just saw from the video. And also, eyeglasses were not mainstream. So, funny enough, reports of magical sightings dropped once eyeglasses were funny how that works. And you can imagine how the foggy, stormy, cloudy woods of Scotland really lend itself to people thinking they saw supernatural things. They were also predominantly agriculture. They did have fishing around the coast. But this is the early 1500s and 1700s. This is the Enlightenment area where education and literacy are really becoming mainstream. And so a lot of Scottish folks weren't, particularly in the ag and fishing, weren't really literate. In fact, a lot of Europeans weren't. They were reliant on their pastors or their ministers to read and translate and interpret the Bible for them. Literacy was available pretty much exclusively to white, wealthy men, most likely Christian. And there were some stories, and we'll hear about them later, of some women being literate, but that's just because they had an awesome dad who got them a tutor. But, mainly, literacy was for men, for boys, and then they would send their boys once they were college age onto the western or to mainland Europe for college. So they were pretty much Christianized by 800. So they had been Christianized for a good 700 years before the witch hunts. They were Catholic, as was pretty much everyone, because Catholicism was the dominant world religion and power. It was not just a religious religion, but it had its fingers in every political thing you can imagine. Wars, kings, trade, local government. I mean, the Catholic Church exerted quite a bit of power, and so when the Protestant Reformation occurred, there was a massive power vacuum. And again, we'll look at that in a second. Some other things that were going on, we mentioned the academia. With the Enlightenment, there was this kind of preference or this favoring of academia, of education, of science, of logic, of reason, and there's a sort of death of magic. So believing in folk healing or magical supernatural, that was starting to come down quite a bit because people are now favoring science and magic. That one a rule. And of course, Scotland had their own petty issues going on, their own politics, as well as Scotland was warring with other kingdoms. So, a lot of chaos, a lot of change. We have a massive religious power change with the Catholic Church falling and the Protestant Reformation and all these different Christian denominations clamoring to be the new dominant worldview, because separation of church and state was not a thing yet, that came with us. So they're all fighting, and then you've got political fights that are just happening in general, and then you've got the changes coming from Enlightenment. So a lot of massive cultural things all coming. As I mentioned, the Catholic Church was the most powerful entity on earth, really until the Reformation. As I mentioned, it had power in everything. It could excommunicate members of the community. There was heavy taxes that they levied on kingdoms and individual provinces. But everybody was expected to pay and answer to the Pope, and England wouldn't like this. So we go, so as the Catholic Church fell in Scotland, there became a wealth of what we would, it's not necessarily religious pluralism, because a lot of it's just pluralism within Christianity, but there's a lot of pluralism going on about different interpretations about what it means to be a Christian. That has been going on forever, ever since the early church. Is definitely, what is the definition of Christianity? And so this created a rift. We had the Presbyterians, the Calvinists, the Puritans, who wanted a decentralized government. They didn't want the government to have anything to do with religion and this church and state. Meanwhile, you had the king, the Episcopal or the Anglican Church, that wanted to continue exactly the setup that the Catholics had, but they just wanted to be like their version of it. So they wanted the Anglican state, that's what it became, the Anglican state. And they wanted everything to be under the morals of this godly state. So everything now that King James is about to implement is all in the name of God, of the Bible, of Christianity, and of ridding the world of demons. But then again, nothing's ever simple, is it? You've got King Henry VIII. He was the one that protested the Catholic Church. Long story short, he wanted to get divorced. The Pope wouldn't let him, so he said, we're leaving. So that happens. His own bloodline, Queen Elizabeth, she takes the throne. She is cousins with Mary, Queen of Scots. Now we're getting into the family tree. I know. It's very incestual history, especially in the European royalty history. Where am I? Okay. So James was coronated at age 12. For those that are familiar with the Queen, Mary, Queen of Scots story, she struggled a lot, to say the least, to be gentle, particularly as a powerful woman in a very Christian patriarchal setting. And when he came to power at age 12, he immediately became the head of state and the head of the church, because it was one. It was a theocracy, a royal monarchy. he would later become the St. King James of the King James Bible. At some point, his cousin, or I guess his great aunt, Queen Elizabeth, beheaded his mother. And this is where he starts to think that there are witches or supernatural demons. That was kind of already in a lot of their theology, especially if you look at Catholicism. There's quite a bit of mysticism in Catholicism. So there was this belief that there were these demonic forces and that conspired to have his mother beheaded. Furthermore, he was super paranoid. His mom getting beheaded, growing up with all the insecurities of trying to stay in power, just constantly paranoid. Like I said, he's not only head of the state, but he's also head of the church, which means he's also head of the bishops, and clergy, and that whole structure. And he's already got this belief system that, supernatural demons plus bad people have killed my mother. He sends ships to Denmark to get his beloved, his betrothed Queen Anne of Denmark there to marry. And he sends for it, and 3 times he sends ships, and all 3 times those ships hit storms. And they can't bring her, can't retrieve her. And so at this point he's like, yeah, see, now the witches, they're involved in my marriage. He also had a legal conflict with a cousin and saw they were already, like I said, France and Germany were already in their witch hunt phases. In fact, that's how Scotland and these sort of isolated areas came to learn about the witches, was through these universities. They go to universities, exchange stories, come home, be like, never believe it. But there were already stories of witch hunts going on, and he and his cousin were in a legal battle, and he blamed his own cousin on witchcraft, that he was associated with sorcery. And his cousin wound up losing the court battle. And so he saw the power of accusing people that he doesn't like to get his way. Again, he's trying to create this entire Scottish area, the Scottish region, to be under the godly state. In 1603, he writes the Demonology, which is all about these supernatural demons that he believes persists, that it is up to him as the head of church and state to get rid of. It also is a very vague sort of prestige on and sort of rallying cry to start hunting witches and these demons. He goes on to start claiming that women in groups are suspicious, they're witches, that women who did have what their society considered supernatural powers, healing, sight, vision, dreams, whatever, that they were generally, especially healers, folk healers, were generally socially accepted. They were seen as sort of like touched by the divine, if you will. And he starts to say, no, they're not touched by the divine, they're touched by Satan. And he starts changing the narrative away from these women have these power to, no, these women have been corrupted. And then, of course, he created the King James Version of the Bible, in which he disseminated across Scotland to all public schools to stamp out pagan religion and to teach children how to read through the Bible. So who was he after? Who were these witches that were such a grave threat to King James and his crew of angry boys? They're typically elderly. A lot of them, I said earlier, they're vulnerable women. A lot of them urban, poor. Most of them are going to be uneducated and illiterate. Perhaps they were widowed, unmarried, never married, whatever. Some of them, I did say poor, but in some cases there were women that had property, that had wealth, and that was also a reason to target them if they wanted their property. They were typically women that weren't too keen on conforming to the Christian patriarchy of their Scottish society. Perhaps again, they're sort of otherwise living alone. Maybe they are tending to their own farm, they've got animals, they're away from town. But they're not here to be dainty ladies. So these non-Christian, non-conforming women of society that are doing their own thing. The biggest thing, it was this phrase, they have it on the bottom, is this smeta. It was used in demonology, it was used in a few documents to define or to talk about what a witch was, and it was basically the phrase for not being feminine. So that was their big target. Women that were not feminine and fertile and useful to be Christian and that were leading the society. So, this is how it all came down. At the very top level, you have King James, who was super paranoid from the get-go. And he already thinks that witches are trying to interfere with his marriage, his mother, his kingdom, all that. Then you start getting into natural disasters. We had a plague, a second wave of the bubonic plague, and poor harvests. A lot of disease that was going on too. So you had a lot of vulnerability within the culture. Really looking for a hero, looking for a savior. Things are not going well right now in Scotland. And then there's all this competing ideological drama unfolding at the commoner level. Are you Calvinist or Presbyterian or Christian or Anglican, and you want the state? This is where Protestant, when we start looking at how many different denominations came out of the Protestant Reformation, we can look at this. So divided, so fragmented. And they were at each other's throats, right? Christian versus Christian. You already had this belief in witches or witchcraft, demons, etc., that came from their own pagan faiths before being converted or influenced by Catholicism. And then even when it was influenced by Catholicism, like I said, the mysticism. You had very strict gender roles of Calvinism. This was a very traditional, very conservative. We can go into the theology of Calvinism, but essentially, Calvinists believe that everything is predestined, that everything that happens to you has already been ordained by God, and that is just what you're supposed to do. You have no free will, you're just here. And particularly strict destinies of each gender and their roles. But interestingly enough, these Presbyterians and Calvinists that were against the state, the Anglican government, persecuted the female or the witches more often, if you looked at a time chart, more often or more frequently when they were having more higher levels of tension with one another. So when they were fighting more, women were being harmed more. And then accusations by locals. So these witches became sort of like a stand-in for everything. If there was infertility, if there was injury or financial hardship or a bad harvest, locals started to look at these women and blame them, these quirky women, for their errors. Are y'all good? I know I'm like info dumping. I basically talked about this already, but in a society where there is religious pluralism, instead in a state-sanctioned religion, you are compelled by the government to worship or believe that religion. But when there's religious pluralism, there's nothing to compel you to do that. And so what winds up coming out of the denominations or the different religions is a sort of competition for believers. They're all trying to recruit believers all the time. So that's going on. Everyone, and what's a great way to compete is by being an extremist, going all the way to fundamentalist. It's marketable, it's noticeable, it's very clear. Extremism tends to be very clear in its mission, agenda. Yes, there, as I was about to say, it's very clear. Everyone's trying to be the most righteous, the most godly. And then, of course, that turns into, in this situation, seeing themselves as heroes for purging Scotland of these women that are demonic. convince their followers that they are doing this godly thing. Again, that demonology and other documents never have a clear definition of a witch, no legal definition of a witch. So they are set, it is vague on purpose because they don't want it to be held accountable. I've already mentioned how folk magic was acceptable, folk healers. But again, this was all coming out of religious fervor, and this was the rallying cry: "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Rather kill a witch than allow her to live." Again, these weren't witches. These were women. These hunters became celebrities, comic books, and then in the newspapers and magazines, and passed around, and pastors would exalt them at their Sunday congregations. It was gossip, it was news, it was headline worthy. It also created a following of copycats, of people thinking they were also official witch hunters and going after women. So really, we don't actually know the exact number because it just became a frenzy. There was this man, Matthew Hawkins. He was actually English, but he came up to Scotland a few times. He killed 300 women. Very lucrative role again. He was a celebrity. He got paid by people who were just fans. He had some arrangement with some churches and some communities. Really like some sort of bounty hunter. And again, these were all happening in urban areas by educated, powerful people. This book right here, Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch Hammer, it's a German book. In Germany, like I said, the witch hunts were going on there. This book is considered the manual to accusing and charging and convicting a woman or person of witchcraft. He had charged or accused someone of witchcraft in Germany and lost the case. And so he said, okay, well, now that I've seen what the case looked like, here are the questions I would have asked to convict a witch. And that became it. This book was circulated all across Europe. And he was very emphatic that purging and burning was the only way to get rid, to rid Scotland of these evil, demonic forces of women. So these are some of the questions. We'll go over them and we'll talk about, they're strange questions to begin with, but even stranger when we talk about the torture methods that went along with them. But they would ask questions like, how did you transport to fulfill your magical tasks? And these women would be like, I didn't. And they'd be like, but how? And I didn't. Like, I'm not a witch. Well, then how did you copulate with the incubi or the devil? I didn't. All these like very, very invasive questions, some ridiculous things about controlling the weather, controlling cattle. And again, they didn't. These intrusive questions really focused on engagements, particularly sexual intercourse with the devil. That's how they were convinced this was happening, that the devil was baiting these women in the middle of the night and then having them do their misbidding. Lots of questions about, not only did you have sex with the devil, but do you have this pact? What does it look like? Who else is involved? Really, a lot of weird, strange questions. And what was especially difficult about all of this is that when they would arrest women, women, as I mentioned, were largely illiterate at the time, so they couldn't write to anyone from jail. Didn't have a phone back then, but there was no way that they could write to anyone. Whenever they signed jail documents, they didn't know what they were signing. So lots of questions around there. They didn't know what they were signing, and then some women would be kept awake for days or even a week at a time. So they would be fully into hallucinating, and people would be asking them questions, have you been with the devil? And if you've been awake for 4 days straight, you might say yes. Again, yeah, involvement in naming others. Again, they couldn't read what they were signing. Some of them were jailed without bail. There are reports and stories of women being held for 6 to 9 months. Again, innocent women. The sleep deprivation is real and was a serious form of the torture. They, like I said, they would sign these legal confessions based on what they said in an interrogation after they'd been kept awake for 3 days. Anything that they said in that interview or that interrogation was then held against them in court. They were starved, shaven. Really, like, the whole thing was to dehumanize them and also to de-women or de-feminize them, just to take away all their humanity, all their power. Of course, they used the bondage and torture tools, which we'll get into next. And then at the time of Scotland's government, physical and sexual assault was not criminalized. And so what would happen is they would take a woman back into a jail cell, and it would be all men, and God knows what happened. So it's really, really quite disturbing what they did with these vulnerable women. But again, couldn't read, couldn't advocate for themselves, and probably didn't have a man at home to call for whatever reason. When these witch hunters would pick up these women, arrest these women, they would shave them and, as I mentioned, just completely dehumanize, defeminize them, because they were looking for the devil's mark, a mark they made up. And they would prick until an area, they would prick the body, I'm getting all tangled up, until no pain was found. And then if they pricked you and you didn't say ow, or it didn't affect you, they would say, aha, she's a witch. So like in the thick of the thigh or somewhere that I probably wouldn't notice or wouldn't be so significant, that's where they would get you. If that spot was near any sort of mole or blemish, they would further use that as evidence that that's the devil's mark. And like I said, these celebrities, John Kincaid was another pricking celebrity, but he eventually came out that he was a fraud. Technically they're all frauds, but he, I guess, drunkenly confessed that none of the women that he pricked were actual witches, and he had done hundreds or something like that. So, nasty business. Here, I don't know if they have a little pointer thing, but here are the legal methods of torture. And again, physical and sexual assault of a prisoner was considered legal. So, this first one, that is a gynecological tool to be inserted inside a woman. It's prickly, spiked, metal, and it expands with a key turn. You have masks like this, or on your far right. Some of them would have mouth inserts so that a woman couldn't talk. Sometimes they would be spiked for further torture. You also have just general different shapes. And then, of course, you have this cartoonish graphic is a sort of stretching machine. So stretching is also used. So this is the godly society that King James is trying to create. As you see, you have women being burned at the stake. You also see women being cuffed, beaten in front of the king, and then burned or thrown into the water. Drowning was another method. So that is a picture taken in Scotland. Here are some of the real stories of Scottish witches that were accused of witchcraft. Isabel had a whole bunch of cats. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, bubonic plague was coming through, a second wave, and her cats scared away a lot of the mice, and she was away from society, the town. So while a lot of the town was coming down with the plague and she was fine, they thought something was afoot. And never mind, it was just nature and distance, social distancing. But she was accused of bewitching her cats to somehow give her an edge. All they did was chase away the bubonic mice. There's Agnes. She was a midwife, and there was, again, in these epidemic plague times, there was, and also just in general, in this time, there's a lot of miscarriages. Women's health and women's reproductive health did not have all the technological advancements we have today. A lot of infertility, a lot of stillborn. And she was accused of casting spells on the mothers that she was facilitating births for. My two favorite stories, the Ellen Gray story. She was friends with the wife of Thomas Riddell, and Thomas was a known philanderer. And he frequented the beds of other women, to say. And he died. And his community, or his friends, all thought that it was Ellen who had poisoned him for cheating on her friend. But really what they think is that it was an STD. This is ultimate downfall. Good. And then Katie Liddell, earlier I talked about how women's illiteracy played a role in their vulnerability and imprisonment. She did come from a wealthier family, and it's probably because she was smart and did know how to read that she was accused of being a witch. But because she did know how to read, she was able to write a letter from jail to a lawyer and get out. So, all right. Okay. So, along the way, there's people that have all these doubts. It's not like, it's just like with anything that's kind of growing, these accusations over time. You hear about witch hunts, maybe you've seen them or whatever. But along the way, people are either fully buying into the Kool-Aid or they are growing more and more doubtful, skeptical, or against the whole witch hunts. Marion Walker was one of those women that did not agree with the witch hunts, and she got into an argument with another woman who claimed to be a witch hunter, because lest we forget that women accuse other women of being witches too. So we had Margaret, who is running around town telling these Christian men in power, hey, I can be your witch hunter, I'll be able to identify women for you, I can do it, I have some witch qualities, but I found Jesus, and I will help you hunt down the women that I believe to be witches. So Margaret's running around doing all this, the king and his allies all saw her as like a superpower. That we got a witch on our side. Well, Mary never believed Margaret, and one day when in town, Margaret is lining up women and like, you're a witch, not you, not you, you. And Marion gets those women the next day, puts them in different clothing, reorganizes the line, and then has the same women go through again. And Margaret is unable to affirm and confirm who is a witch the second time. And this was public. This was done in town square. People start to get skeptical. So now people are starting to think, wait a minute, if Margaret is a fraud, who else is a fraud? It's very public, sparks the whole thing. Somehow Marion got a copy or intercepted a letter from a celebrity witch hunter talking about writing a letter to a royal person in the royal court saying, I don't know what we're going to do with this Margaret situation. If they find out how many women we've done this to, we're going to be screwed. Paraphrasing. But all the witch hunters are now starting to freak out that they're being caught, and they are. The whole charade is coming out. So why did the witch hunts end the Enlightenment? The same universities and colleges where a lot of those men learned about witches, and witchcraft and witch hunts and witch accusations to begin with, they decided, no, it's silly to believe in witches. In fact, Ben Franklin wrote an article in the newspaper that said, you still believe in witches at this point, you're dumb. Paraphrasing. So there was just a huge loss of belief in the magical and the supernatural in light of the Enlightenment for academia. Religious pluralism just kept taking over, particularly by the time we get to the United States. And again, the Salem witch trials were in the United States, but it just started to change things. All these different denominations, they'd all grown. They just, I don't want to say they matured, because they didn't. Look where we are now, we're all still fighting. But like, things are just a little different. And then finally in 1735, the Witchcraft Act was repealed. So, Salem's witch trials. When the Puritans came over to Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, they brought their beliefs with them. And some of those beliefs were in witches. So Massachusetts was a big one. I know Rhode Island is also. But when people started coming over here in the New World, they brought that. So you can now tell people the Salem witch trials are connected to the Scottish witch hunts. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a resurgence of artifact collection, particularly torture. Torture had been outlawed, particularly going into the 1900s, as a form of punishment. And so torture tools, particularly like these dungeon torture tools, are pretty obsolete. They become collector's items. Then you start seeing it in mainstream media. Bewitched was one of them. If y'all remember correctly, Bewitched was the story of a 1960s housewife witch that was magical and could do all these powerful things as long as she kept to her place as a housewife. And then you have, of course, Harry Potter in the 2000s. There's also a heavy emphasis on the sexualization that also came from the collection of torture artifacts. There was the internet was a big one, of just putting communities of like-minded folks together to talk about all this. Something people typically assign the green face to witches. You can see witches don't have green faces necessarily. It's more of being either starved or beaten to death or beaten, or just general malnutrition. But there's no story where there's green faces. And then Stevie Nicks, funny enough, who has been glamorized as America's witch, she had to release a statement because so many people kept sending her like dead rabbit's feet and other charms for her witchiness that she made. You have to stop this. This is just for fun. So finally, the Scottish Prime Minister issued an apology to the witches. I know someone just gave me another pardon from the UK, so thank you for that. There you go. So thank you for that. But formal apologies from the government have been disseminated. But yeah, really the themes that I want y'all to walk away with is to notice how political scapegoating of vulnerable populations happens when dominating groups are fighting. When those two groups are fighting, other groups get harmed even more than they were before the conflict. And then, just understanding how religious pluralism kind of created this whole new world of government, of new standards, of new ideas of citizenship, of equality, of power, of access. Thank you for coming to learn about the Scottish witch hunts of the 1500s through the 1700s. I hope that this fire hose of information all makes sense to you, and that you now have something to say when people start talking about witch hunts. Thank you. I don't know what time it is.
We have time for questions.
Oh, I didn't burn witches, they burned women. Here's the timeline that we can look at it. Sources, because I know people like that. Sources.
So is this going on in England as well at the same time?
Yeah, and it's going on in England. In fact, King James of Scotland became the King James of England, all of it.
I do have a couple of questions. So, like, the witches back then, do like the psychics and all the stuff today, are they like witches too?
That's a great question.
Because psychics and doing the cards and everything, could they be witches?
Theoretically, the phrase witches in this case is really a derogatory kind of statement. Again, they had folk healers and magic.
And then how could you tell that somebody was a witch?
Accusations, yeah.
But how could you tell? It doesn't make sense.
Typically it started if someone didn't like you. Yeah.
So it's not like wicked or
No, that would be nice if they had green faces and they were,
and it's like not like Harry Potter, like with the wands. They didn't have wands and everything. They just
Yeah, it was kind of a perfect storm of right before academia is taking off, and there's still a lot of belief in the supernatural. Again, the eyeglasses.
Did they have like brooms they could fly on?
No, they were just normal, regular women that had been accused for political and religious reasons.
When it started, when King James started the movement, in your kind of take, did it take convincing, or were it just like people were preaching to the choir and they just wanted to do it anyway?
There was a time of like it did need to be convinced because, again, you have the existing belief in the supernatural that's starting to die off, but then you have people, reputable people in the community that are going to university, coming back and saying, oh, they're talking about witch hunts across the way. And so there's some doubt, but there's also renewed fervor, and then really there was just a lot of political unrest and anger, and they went after the women.
They say anything about how James became so paranoid? Was it just trauma, and he's a little nutty, and also a perfect like excuse comes along, or was it like drugs and like that type of thing?
I don't know too much about King James and drugs, but,
Okay.
but yeah, to be the child of royalty or power in general, you're going to just be raised with a sense of insecurity. And then, of course, his mom was constantly being threatened, her title to the throne was being threatened, so he watched that with her, and then he watched her get beheaded. So he was just a scared, neurotic king.
So I know King James is like the person that kind of really started all of this, but it spans 200 years. How did that impact his children or whoever proceeded after him?
Yeah, they took over and kept this going. There was also, I know I'm starting to get into the literary English history in general, but something interesting is that Shakespeare's Macbeth about the witches was influenced by the Scottish witch hunts. So yeah, pop culture, his progeny and successors, they continued, perpetuated it.
Are there still witches today? Like, is there still some?
I know there's plenty of people that consider themselves to be gifted. I don't know if they consider themselves witches. I know that there are people that consider themselves witches. But yeah, it's such a broad term for
lot of other like if you thought about like the cats and the witches and the significance there, did you see a lot of other things that were, kind of tied into witches, like the culture of that we see today? Like, broomstick, like, did you see like where any of that came from?
As far as like being associated with witches?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was thinking, I didn't hear you correctly. Yeah, so we got the feral cats associated with them. There was some accusations of being able to levitate, and then that was, the broomstick was their own answer. Like, women did not answer that. It was like these groups of Christian men in power that were like, well, how does she get around and fly? And they're like, well, she's always cleaning, right? She's just getting on her room. As far as like the big cauldron, many of them you're talking about were folk healers and had a reputation, like people came to them.
Seeing the future?
Visions, yeah, psychic. So yeah, there was all this, they were kind of normal things that became associated with them.
For the women accused, were there very many that actually got away with it? I mean, once accused, were you pretty much done? Was there any percentage that maybe got?
Yeah, so I know 8,000 women were accused, and I want to say something like 20% were able to like get out. You have isolated stories like maybe she was a literate woman or a woman with resources or access to resources. Sometimes it would be so obvious that it was a fake accusation or something. But there was a real bloodthirst. There was a need for a victim, particularly when the two dominating groups are fighting. And they're not going, there were battles, but this bloodlust came out this way because it wasn't terrifically militant at this time. It does become more. So, what else?
Were there any men?
Yeah. Men were accused, men that were not, as mentioned, men could be accused by the king as a political move. It could also be, you thought that men cheated, with business, or could be with your wife. There was also at the same time, now there is a consensus among scholars that King James experimented sexually. And was open to diverse partners. But that being said, he still instituted the Sodomy Act, which banned homosexuality essentially. And they would use the Sodomy Act and the Witchcraft Act together and would accuse homosexual men of witchcraft and so on.
How about children?
Yes, but they also believe that children can be saved. Right,
How's that possible?
through Christian education.
When it was like towards the end, was there any like retribution? I mean, like people that were witch hunters, accusers. I mean, I don't know, court trial is the right thing, but like, was there any punishment for them at the end?
Yes and no. Like no, and yes, there were people that were held accountable, but not a satisfying number. It's kind of similar to the Nuremberg trials or something. It's like, yeah, but what justice is that? I'm really thankful that y'all came tonight. I did this last year and it was a hit, and I hope that I can continue to do this for Halloween. Because it's really important to remember what the state and religion are capable of with vulnerable populations. So there's history. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Leigh. So this is part of a Leigh Larson speaker series. So this was number for 2, and we have 2 more lined up with Leigh. So on November 25th, right before Thanksgiving, we're going to be talking about the truth about Thanksgiving. Proper name. And then on December 9th, we're going to have Leigh back doing A Baby Born in the North, Indigenous and Early American Pioneer Reproduction in the American West. So we hope to continue conversations with Leigh. Maybe that's what we should call it. Conversations with Leigh. But we hope to continue these as she is a researcher, a scholar, and somebody who just loves to dive into the dirty details of things. So stay tuned for more on all of that. As always, we have lots going on here at the library. Tomorrow, in case any of y'all have children, it's the Jabberdoggy and Other Made-Up Words performance here in the accordingly room. I don't think that you need to have kids for the actual performance in the evening, but during the day they're gonna learn how to stage fight. So that's pretty nifty. And then we always have digital literacy classes going through November 12th. Book clubs happening all the time at the Great Falls Public Library. We have silent book club on Saturday over at Luna Coffee Bar. I got 2 people, 3 people, 4 who do that in the audience right now. And we are just always excited to bring new programming to you guys, and connecting people and knowledge is all that we do here at the Great Falls Public Library. So thank you again for coming. The door might be locked when you leave today. If it is, please push the doors closed behind you, because they don't lock by themselves. So make sure you push the door closed, okay? Maybe not in like another person's face, but push them shut. Understand?
Yep.
Take popcorn and candy, because otherwise I'll eat it. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.